Cameron winked, annoying me with how much it pleased me that my answer was good enough. I wasn't one of the boys, so why did I care? Dylan, sometime server and soon-to-be nurse, grinned. I can take that one. Christian mentioned it. Big shock there. Like I didn't already know that he'd been the one to leak it. But why? This wasn't my first birthday here. Why had he found it necessary to inflict, I glanced around, this on me? He knew I hated being the center of attention. Hell, everyone knew. The customers even knew. Unfortunately for you, Cameron leaned his elbow on the bar stool next to him. Even though it's your party, you still have to work. We couldn't find a second bartender for today to cover your shift. He looked at me conspiratorially, and I sighed with relief. Okay, maybe I personally wasn't looking for a caretaker, but in this instance, if Cameron's need to look out for someone meant that he'd make sure I didn't have to socialize, I'd take it. Isn't that ridiculous? Toby asked, stomping his foot in irritation. Shrugging, I headed back behind the bar. It is what it is. I mouthed, thank you, to Cameron, making him chuckle. He hooked his arm around Toby's neck. Come on, we're going to need you to be the life of the party. Toby wouldn't have any problem with that, so I grabbed a bar towel and nodded at Leslie, a weekend bartender. I'm here. She blew out a breath of air. Thank goodness. They all descended on me the minute you left to run that errand for Christian. Cameron told me that he and Christian had this planned out to the minute. I should have taken him more literally. Menaces, all of them. I'd stepped out because Christian needed me to pick up some things, like lemons and limes that we'd run out of, and came back to a birthday party in my honor. Ridiculousness. Though it finally made sense how we'd mysteriously run out of the produce. Leslie snorted. Yeah, I don't know what you did to make them pursue you so relentlessly, but you're definitely one of them whether you want to be or not. While she reached over to hand a customer a beer, I escaped to the far end of the bar where I preferred to work if more than one of us was on shift. It was near the wall, so the lighting was darker and more intimate. It had become my spot when I first started working up front. There was no hiding the scar that ran down my cheek, and for the most part, I'd come to terms with it. Initially, it felt like it gave me a little privacy. But these days, I really didn't care about that. In the last 2 years, only a couple of people had ever had the nerve to outright stare or comment, and they'd come to regret it. It didn't matter who you were. If you worked at the Tap, as employees and locals called it, you were under Christian's protection, which also included being under Ollie, the doorman's purview, and neither of them fucked around when it came to our safety and well-being. As I served drinks, I watched the partygoers and customers who inserted themselves into the festivities. I realized that I knew all of them, had conversed with all of them at one time or another. They'd all been on a stool across the bar from me and poured out their hearts about a boyfriend, girlfriend, parent, work issue, whatever, while I poured their drinks. These were all people that if I ran into them on the street, I'd actually stop and exchange a greeting. Were they really all here for me? For my birthday? Or were they here for the finger foods Toby provided at functions, to have an excuse to party? My gaze slid around the room, and I had to admit that the majority of them were 100% here because it was my birthday. After tackling me when I first entered, Joey had made his way back to Tucker. They made such a striking couple. As real estate moguls, they usually showed up dressed to impress, well-groomed and in sharp suits. Watching Joey smirk at his daddy, it was hard to remember him as the guy who'd considered himself frail, beaten down by the death of his grandmother and a chronic illness. I'd never seen him as weak, though. He'd come to work here after her death, and he'd done what he needed to do. Once he'd started dating Tucker, though, he thrived. Next to him, Dylan's head was thrown back in laughter while Brett, his personal trainer daddy, stood with his arms crossed over his chest, watching him with amusement. Before the guys had embarked on their whole search for a daddy, which had included these absolutely absurd wanted signs that expressed what kind of daddy they wanted or thought they needed, Dylan had been the one I thought least likely to want that type of relationship. Sure, he'd had his issues like any other breathing human, but he'd been so sure of what he wanted to do with his life. I'd considered his desire and drive to be a nurse so admirable, and I'd been a little startled to find out that he wasn't more of the daddy type himself. Then he'd begun hanging out with Brett, and it had all clicked into place. Dylan had the drive on his own, but Brett was like the wind beneath his wings. They were well suited. Toby skipped past, causing a ruckus, waving his hands to get...